The firelight trembles against the stone walls of Kattegat's great hall. Outside, wind claws at the doors, carrying the sound of waves breaking against the cliffs. Inside, a single figure sits upon the high seat, the queen of a kingdom built on storms. Her name is Aslaug. Once, the skalds sang of her beauty and her prophecy. They called her the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, born of legend, destined for greatness. And when Ragnar Lothbrok made her his wife, it seemed the gods themselves had written their tale. But stories have cruel endings, and the songs forgot to tell hers. It begins with absence. Ragnar is gone, far across the sea, chasing fame and gold. His ships have not been seen for months, maybe years. The hall still bears his name, his shields hang on the wall, but the air belongs to silence now. Aslaug sits upon the throne that still smells of him, smoke, salt, and battle. Her fingers trace the carvings on the armrest, wolves, serpents, longships. Each line was once a promise. She had believed him when he said, "You are my equal." But what is equality when one rules the waves and the other rules the emptiness he leaves behind? In the early years, she had waited faithfully. Every time the horn sounded from the fjord, her heart would rise, hoping it was Ragnar's sails breaking through the mist. She would rush to the harbour, her long hair caught in the wind, the people bowing as she passed. But it was always another trader, another stranger with news of the king's victories, and of women who watched him with wonder. Each story of his glory made the crowd cheer, and made her smaller. At night, she sat alone, the fire dimming, the air heavy with smoke. She would whisper his name into the darkness, as if the sea could carry it back to him. Ragnar! No answer ever came. The people of Kattegat loved their absent king. They spoke of him with pride, their eyes shining. But when they looked at Aslaug, their voices softened, respectful, distant. They saw her not as queen, but as the keeper of his memory. That realization hurt more than the loneliness, because Aslaug was not weak. She was clever, sharp as ice, raised among seers and storytellers. The blood of heroes ran through her veins, yet in Ragnar's shadow, none of that seemed to matter. There is a night she will never forget. The sky was black, the wind biting. She walked alone to the cliffs above the fjord. Below her, waves crashed against the rocks like drums of war. She wrapped Ragnar's cloak tighter around her shoulders, the same one he had left behind after his last raid. It still smelled faintly of sea salt and pine tar. She looked out over the endless water and whispered, "Do you still remember me?" Only the ocean replied, roaring, restless, indifferent. Winter came, heavy and unkind. Snow pressed against the roofs, the livestock grew thin, and the people turned to her for help. For the first time, Aslaug gave orders not in Ragnar's name, but in her own. She rationed grain, bargained with traders, kept the fires burning. When the frost finally broke, Kattegat still stood, and the people began to murmur new words. Quiet at first, then bolder. The Queen saved us. That night, as she sat by the hearth, she felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Pride. But with pride came guilt. Months passed. Still no ships. Letters from the east arrived. Ragnar's hand, brief and cold. The raid succeeded. The men are strong. Tell the boys to train. No, I miss you. No, are you well? Aslaug folded the parchment and placed it beside the fire. She watched the ink curl and blacken in the flames. She thought, perhaps the gods never meant for us to share a throne. The hall that had once echoed with laughter now echoed with her footsteps. Each step reminded her that she ruled alone, not as a wife waiting for her husband, but as a queen waiting for her destiny to choose her. She began to notice how people listened when she spoke, how the jarls leaned closer when she gave counsel, how even the old warriors lowered their voices in her presence. Power, she realized, does not shout, it whispers, and the whisper had begun to reach her. Still, at night, she fought with her own heart. She would light a single candle beside Ragnar's chair and imagine him there, his eyes bright, his voice low. "Do you still love me?" she would ask the flame. The candle flickered, then steadied, its light trembling across the walls. In that trembling glow she saw herself not as his wife, but as something else entirely, something the world had not yet named. By spring, she walked differently, straighter, slower. The people noticed. They began to bow not for Ragnar's queen, but for Queen Aslaug, and yet deep within her, the silence still lingered. That quiet, aching wound that no crown could fill. She had everything a woman could want, but she had no one to share it with. There is a saying in the North, the gods test those they wish to raise. If that is true, then the gods were watching her closely. Because one evening, as the sun set blood red over the fjord, a messenger arrived with news from across the sea. Ragnar's raid had succeeded again. He had taken lands, treasures, and a queen's heart that was not hers. Her hand froze around the parchment. Lagerta's name was written between the lines like a ghost. She read it once, twice. Then she tore the letter apart, the pieces fluttering into the fire like dying birds. The crackling flame reflected in her eyes. Bright, alive, dangerous. The woman who had waited, who had prayed, who had whispered to the sea. She died quietly that night. In her place rose a queen who would never wait again. She turned toward the great hall, its banners heavy with dust and time. The silence still hung in the air. But now it sounded different. It sounded like opportunity. Aslaug placed her hand on the throne once more. It no longer felt cold. The fire burned low, its light reaching the carved faces of gods above her. She whispered to them, "If the sagas will not remember me as his wife, then they will remember me as something greater." Outside, the sea roared. It sounded almost like an answer. And somewhere beyond the horizon, Ragnar Lothbrok sailed toward another legend, unaware that the greatest battle of his life was not across the sea, but waiting for him at home. The hall smelled of smoke and secrets. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was listening. The banners above Aslaug's throne swayed softly, whispering of power, of loyalty, of fear. Ragnar was gone again, chasing lands across the sea, while Kattegat breathed beneath her watch. She should have felt peace. Instead, she felt the eyes. Every court meeting, every feast, every prayer. Someone was watching her, measuring her worth, wondering if a woman could hold the weight of a king's crown. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself she ruled only for Ragnar, that every order she gave, every decision she made, was for his people, not for herself. But the whispers would not stop. "They say the king grows weaker," one voice murmured behind a cup of ale. "They say his heart belongs to another," said another. "They say Aslaug rules now, and she likes it." The last one hurt most because deep down, it was true. Aslaug had waited years for Ragnar to come home. She remembered the first time she met him, a stranger at her door, drawn by stories of her beauty and her wisdom. He called her the daughter of prophecy, and she had loved him for it. But prophecy fades when years pass in silence. Now, when his ships left the fjord, she no longer prayed for his safe return. She prayed for the courage to stop needing him. The nights in Kattegat grew longer. Wind howled through the wooden beams, carrying with it stories from beyond the sea. Traders spoke of Ragnar's triumphs, and of Lagertha. Her name fell into the hall like an arrow. Lagertha, the warrior woman, Ragnar's first love, the one who fought beside him, who still lived in song and story. Vigal, people spoke of her as if she were a goddess. Brave, fearless, beloved Aslaug's hand tightened around her cup until the wine spilled down her fingers. She tried to smile, to pretend the stories didn't sting. But that night, when the hall emptied, she sat alone before the fire and whispered, "Do they not remember who I am?" Her voice cracked, softer than the crackle of the flames. Days turned to weeks. A jarl named Eirik began visiting her often, clever, sharp-tongued, the kind of man who knew how to bend truth until it sounded like loyalty. He spoke softly, always with a bow. "Kattegat thrives under you, my queen. The people respect your rule, perhaps more than his." Aslaug said nothing. He leaned closer. "Why should you live in his shadow? You built this peace. You feed these people. The gods favor you now." She told him to leave, but his words lingered. That night, she dreamt of a serpent, Ragnar's serpent, wrapping itself around her throat. When she awoke, her hands trembled. Aslaug began walking through the marketplace more often, watching her people quietly. She saw mothers feeding their children, blacksmiths hammering iron, fishermen returning with empty nets. She realized something. They didn't speak of Ragnar anymore. They spoke of her. Queen Aslaug gave us the grain. Queen Aslaug settled the debts. Queen Aslaug saved the harvest. Each time she heard it, a spark of pride flickered inside her. And with pride came guilt. She told herself it wasn't betrayal. She was only keeping his kingdom alive. But some nights, when the wind howled like the sea, she heard Ragnar's voice in her head. You were meant to wait for me. The next spring, messengers arrived from England. They brought gold, wine, and a letter. Ragnar's seal pressed deep in red wax. Her fingers trembled as she broke it open. My raids prosper. I will return when the gods will it. Tell our sons I fight for their name. No, I miss you. No, I love you. Only orders. Only distance. She folded the letter carefully and set it in the fire. As it burned, she whispered, Then I will fight for mine. Eric returned days later. He came not as an advisor, but as an ally. The people are restless, he said. They want a ruler who stands with them, not a ghost across the sea. Let us rule together, Aslaug. For Kattegat. For the future. His words were dangerous and tempting. She looked out toward the sea, where Ragnar's ships should have been. The horizon was empty. If he returns, she said quietly, he will kill us both. Eric smiled. If he returns. That silence, that pause, was where betrayal began. In the following months, Aslaug's rule grew stronger. She gathered loyal jarls, secured trade routes, and forged alliances. Her decisions were wise, her leadership admired. Yet every victory felt hollow, because each one brought her closer to treason. Every time she signed her name on a decree, she imagined Ragnar's face, not the warrior king, but the man she once loved. She wondered what he would say if he saw her now. Would he see strength or betrayal? One evening, as the sun bled red over the fjord, Aslaug stood on the balcony of the hall. The air smelled of pine and ash. Below her, the people were dancing, celebrating the end of a good harvest. Their laughter rose like music, and for the first time she felt something strange. Not love, not guilt, freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when a person stops waiting for someone who will never return. She turned to Eric, who stood beside her. Do they love me? She asked. They fear you, he said softly. And that is better. Aslaug looked back at the crowd. No, she whispered. Fear fades. I want them to remember. The torches flickered in her eyes. For a moment, she looked less like a queen, and more like the flame itself. But power, once taken, begins to whisper back. Soon the priests began to question her. They said the gods no longer spoke to her, that her rule had angered Odin himself. And though Aslaug stood tall in public, at night she prayed in secret. Have I sinned, All-Father, or have I simply become what you made me? The wind offered no answer, only silence. The same silence that had once haunted her when Ragnar was gone. The hall grew restless again. The people sensed something coming. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. And far across the sea, Ragnar Lothbrok, the man she once loved, the king she had replaced, was sailing home. His return would change everything. The sea was not calm that morning. It churned like a beast waking from sleep, its waves striking the cliffs of Kattegat as if warning the shore. He is coming home. Ragnar Lothbrok's sails cut through the mist, black and torn, heavy with rain. He had returned, not as the golden hero of songs, but as a man who had seen too much death, too much distance. His hands were rougher, his eyes darker. The years had taken more than he ever imagined. He expected cheers, horns, celebration. Instead, there was silence, no banners of welcome, no queen waiting at the harbour, only soldiers he did not know, and faces that would not meet his eyes. Aslaug stood at the window of the great hall, watching his ships approach. The torches outside flickered against the wind. She had known this day would come, but not so soon. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she whispered, "The gods are cruel in how they keep their promises." Eric entered behind her, his voice low. "If you open those gates, he will take everything. The crown, your sons, your name." Aslaug turned. "And if I don't? Then you will take what's already yours." Her hand trembled as she lifted her cloak. Somewhere deep inside, she wanted to run to the shore, to see him again, to remember the man she once loved. but the queen she had become would not let her. By the time Ragnar reached the gates of Kattegat, rain was pouring hard, washing the dirt of the sea from his face. He looked up at the walls he had built, the towers he had raised, and there, above the gate, he saw her. Aslaug, not in rags, not in tears, but in royal furs, standing beside Eirik. The sight hollowed him. He called out her name, but she did not answer. The gates did not open. Inside the hall, Aslaug's heart beat so hard it hurt. The men waited for her command. Her sons, half-grown now, were watched in confusion. Ragnar shouted again, "Aslaug, this is my home!" And in the silence that followed, her voice rose. Calm, steady, cold. It was. Those words echoed off the wooden beams like thunder. Eirik stepped forward and gave the order. The gates remained closed. Ragnar's men looked at one another. The truth was clear now. Their king was no longer king. Days passed under tense skies. Ragnar's camp grew outside the city walls, the standoff stretching with every sunrise. Inside, Aslaug ruled, outwardly confident, inwardly trembling. Every choice felt heavier than the last. At night she sat by the fire, staring at the serpent carvings along the hall. Once they had symbolized his power, now they seemed to coil around her conscience. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not in anger, but in disbelief. The same eyes that once held love now held only loss. On the fourth night, a messenger came. He carried a white flag. Ragnar wished to speak. The council urged caution. Eirik urged refusal. But Aslaug, perhaps guided by guilt, perhaps by longing, agreed. They met at dawn, outside the walls, under a pale sky streaked with red. For a moment, neither spoke. The years between them stood like ghosts. Ragnar's voice was quiet. "You close my gates." Aslaug's answer was softer. "You left them open too long." He took a step closer. "I fought for this land, for you, for our sons." She looked at him, tears burning behind her calm. "And I ruled it when you chose glory over us." Silence fell. The wind carried the sound of the waves. The same sea that had once connected them now, roaring between their hearts. Ragnar's tone hardened. "You sit beside a traitor, and you lay beside another woman," she said. His jaw clenched. The truth in her words hurt more than any blade. The meeting ended without peace. By nightfall, Ragnar's army surrounded Kattegat. The horns of war sounded across the valley. Aslaug walked through the empty hall, every step echoing like a drum. Eirik was already preparing his men, his confidence sharp and reckless. When he approached her throne, he smiled. "You were right to stand against him. Soon they will sing your name, not his." But Aslaug did not smile back. Something in her chest felt wrong, as if the gods themselves were watching, silent and disappointed. The battle began at sunrise. Arrows darkened the sky. Shields clashed. The ground shook beneath the weight of men who once called each other brothers. From the balcony, Aslaug watched smoke rise from her own kingdom. Her sons stood beside her, eyes wide, confused. She whispered to them, "Do not hate your father. The gods made us play our parts." Below, Ragnar moved through the chaos like the storm he once was, fierce, relentless, unbroken. His army cut through the gates by noon. Eirik fought bravely, but arrogance is a poor shield. Ragnar found him near the steps of the hall and ended him with a single strike. When the blade fell, the war ended. The doors of the great hall burst open. Ragnar stepped inside, drenched in rain, his sword dripping red. Aslaug stood waiting. She did not run. She did not beg. He stopped before her throne, breathing hard. "You took what was mine," he said. She looked up at him, calm, proud, and heartbreakingly human. "I kept what you abandoned." Ragnar's sword wavered. He could kill her, and the people would cheer. But instead, he turned the blade away. "I will not make you a martyr," he said. "You will live, but your name will die." And with that, he walked out, leaving her surrounded by the silence she had built. That night, Aslaug sat alone by the cold hearth. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt washed away. She thought of their first meeting, of laughter, of warmth, of all that had burned to reach this moment. Her reflection in the bronze mirror looked like a stranger, a queen without a crown, a woman without a name. Outside, the sea roared softly against the cliffs, as if mourning her. She whispered, Is this what the gods wanted of me? No voice answered, only the wind through the broken door, carrying away the last echo of her reign. The sea never stops speaking. Even when the world turns its back, it whispers to those who listen. Years had passed since Kattegat last spoke Aslaug's name, the woman who once ruled beside. Ragnar Lothbrok now lived in the quiet shadows of the western fjords. Far from the songs, far from the throne. Her hall was small, her fire dim. Every night the wind crept through the cracks of the walls, carrying with it faint echoes of the kingdom she had lost. No one called her queen anymore. To the villagers nearby, she was simply the widow by the shore. But even they could feel something strange about her. The way she stared out to sea for hours, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Sometimes, at dawn, she walked barefoot along the rocks. The cold waves bit at her skin, but she welcomed it. Pain was proof she was still alive. She carried a small wooden figure with her, a carving of a serpent Ragnar had once made for her. The edges were worn now, the details fading, like memory itself. She would turn it in her hands and whisper, "Do you still hate me, my love?" The only answer was the wind. At night, she dreamed of Kattegat. She saw the hall filled with light again, her sons laughing, Ragnar smiling from across the fire. And then, as dreams do, everything turned to smoke. The banners burned, the laughter vanished, and she was standing alone, her crown sinking into the sea. She would wake in tears, whispering prayers to gods who no longer seemed to listen. "Odin, if I was your lesson, what did you teach them through me?" Her sons sometimes visited, though never for long. Ivar, clever and ruthless, had become a leader in his own right. He looked at her not with love, but with a kind of pity he tried to hide. Mother and son spoke little. "Father is remembered," he once said. "They call him Legend now," Aslaug smiled sadly. "And what do they call me?" He didn't answer. When he left, she watched his ship disappear into the mist. Another man she had loved, swallowed by the same sea that had taken Ragnar. Seasons came and went. The winters grew harsher. In the village, people whispered stories about the old woman who talked to the wind. Some said she had once been a witch. Others said she spoke with the gods themselves. Children dared each other to approach her house, but few did. Inside, the walls were covered in runes, words carved by Aslaug's own trembling hands. They told her story not as history would, but as memory does. Messy, human, aching. One rune stood out above the rest. It read, "Love became silence. Silence became power. Power became regret." One evening, a travelling skald came to her door. He had heard whispers of the forgotten queen and wanted to know her truth. She poured him mead, though her hands shook as she held the cup. He asked her what really happened, how she could betray Ragnar Lothbrok, the greatest king the North had ever known. Aslaug looked into the fire, her face lit by the glow of its dying flame. "Do you think it was easy?" she asked softly. "To love a man who loved the world more than you?" The skald said nothing. She continued, voice trembling. "They will tell you I wanted power, but I only wanted to be seen, to be more than a name on his lips between wars." She leaned closer to the fire, eyes reflecting the flame. "He made me his queen, then left me his ghost. I ruled in his place. But every crown is a curse when it's built on loneliness." The skald, moved by her words, promised to tell her story truthfully. But Aslaug smiled, bitter and knowing. No one remembers the queen who failed to love the right way. When he left the next morning, he looked back at her house. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin, grey, fading into the cold sky. Time, the cruelest god, continued his work. Aslaug grew frail. Her once golden hair turned silver, her voice softer. The sea became her only companion, the waves her confession. Some say she spent her last days writing, carving runes into wood and stone, each one a piece of her soul she hoped the gods might read. Others say she sang to the wind, asking it to carry her voice to Valhalla, where Ragnar waited. On her final morning, she sat by the water's edge, the serpent carving in her hand. The tide crept higher around her feet, gentle and cold. The sun was rising, gold spilling across the waves. She smiled faintly. "I have waited long enough," she whispered. The wind lifted her hair, the sea shimmered, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped to listen. When the villagers found her, She was sitting upright, her eyes open toward the horizon. Her expression was calm, peaceful, as if she had finally found the one place that never left her. Years later, travelers spoke of strange things near the cliffs of Kattegat. On quiet nights, they said, you could hear a woman's voice singing, low and sorrowful, carried by the wind. Some claimed it was just the sea. Others swore it was the queen who had once betrayed a king. No one knew her name anymore. But when storms rose without warning, the fishermen would bow their heads and murmur, "The sea remembers." Because in some way it did. History is cruel to women who want too much. It praises their beauty, fears their mind, and buries their truth. Aslaug's story was rewritten, softened, reshaped. Some called her the witch who tempted Ragnar. Others called her the serpent who destroyed him. But perhaps the truth was simpler. She was a woman, proud, intelligent, wounded, caught in a world where love was never enough. And when love failed her, she reached for power. It was not greed that doomed her. It was longing, the kind that makes even the strongest hearts break in silence. Now, centuries later, her name lies between myth and memory. But if you ever stand by the shores of Norway and hear the sea whispering through the rocks, listen closely, because in the roar of the waves, you might still hear her voice, not as a queen, not as a traitor, but as a woman who wanted to be remembered.